So I'll slowly start to bring some folks on. So first panelist who's going to be brought on is Travis. Travis should have a doctor in front of his name because he's just that smart. Travis is Harvard educated. He's a material scientist. And once you see what he's doing and why he's here, I'm sure you're going to be impressed. Next, I'd like to bring on Greg. Greg I've known for a while. To describe Greg's job would honestly do it injustice. He's currently at BMW Ventures, but honestly, his actual job is galactic operator. He sort of fixes things for anyone, and he's honestly the person who honestly taught me how to make budgets. Next, I'd like to bring on Blake Teipel. Blake also deserves a doctor in front of his name. He's also a material scientist and truly working on revitalizing his section of the industry. And quite honestly, once you see him talk, you'll see basically his love and passion for the industry ooze out. Next, I'd like to bring on James Taylor. James is at HB Tech Ventures. He has also had a pretty storied career. He actually worked with our CMO, Sean, at Apple. And the idea is James is kind of at the forefront of what's going on in this space. And then finally, I'd like to bring on our special guest panelist, Klopp. He was one of the co-founders of The North Face, a company that you may have heard of. He's an accomplished writer. He recently put out a book called Almost, and he's here to honestly impart his wisdom. So I'm hoping everyone has their ears, and eyes peeled just to see what Hap has to say. So with that, I think we can start off the panel. So I'll kind of direct the first question over to Hap. Let's see, is Hap visible on here now? Yep. So Hap, clearly a lot is kind of going on in the industry right now. Whether the black swan event, namely COVID, is happening or not. How do you see this as kind of different or the same in kind of your experience and kind of historically, what's your perspective on what's going on?
Well, thank you, Harshil. Nice to be here. If we can, maybe we could pull up a couple of slides, which I provided Sarah, starting with slide number 1. And this is my high-level perspective, which is effectively COVID-19 is not the first crisis of the century. If you look at these, and I think we're all familiar with them, and there's the internet bubble in 2000, then there was the 9/11 attack in New York City that disrupted the USA more than any other place. SARS happened. It disrupted Asia, no known transmission since 2004. Then we had the Great Recession in 2007, 2008, and now we have Corona, which is, as you see, the most recent one. And it's affecting the entire market. It's certainly interrupted the longest bull market that you have. If you go to the next slide, what you see is my belief is that each of these crises killed some companies that were probably dying anyway, killed some industries in some cases, but it created an incredible base for new firms that had new technologies and new approaches. If we go to the next slide, this is a little hard to see, but probably the easiest thing to look at is some of the companies that grew out of these last crises. The .com, which you see there, if you look on the left-hand side, you can see that that was the generation of Tesla, DocuSign, Facebook, and on and on. If you look at the great financial crisis, and which followed that, and that happened in 2008, 2009, and 2010, the companies that came out of that were Uber, Slack, Square, and all of those that you see next door that existed. The point that I'm making is every crisis is also an opportunity. And what it's doing is we have an accelerated pace of society. It's not increasing in a linear fashion. It's actually increasing in an exponential fashion. And these crises amplify that. They make it move in a big way. For additive manufacturing, I see this as the pivotal time that it's going to come forward. It's going to come forward for a variety of ways. If you go to the next slide, this is a quote from Darwin. It's one that I hang on to and really believe is that while the crisis will pass, it's not going to be the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent. It's the one most adaptable to change. What happens when this is you have a great plan, the business plan's all written out, and then you suddenly have to pivot, either because of speed or because of change or because of the companies that are thriving versus the ones that are struggling. If we go to the next one, is just a chart I put together with some other people where I teach at Holt University, but it is a way of looking at that. And what I did is put 2 buttons on there. On the left is the ones with the most negative impact, the buttons on the right with the most positive impact, and then the sort of semicircles around those. The further in you get to the button, the more impact that you will have. I did this because I was trying to sit down and analyze who can take advantage of these and how can we pivot some of the businesses I'm involved into to capitalize on what the opportunities are going to be, rather than just sit and wring our hands over the problems that exist on that existing business, because the crisis will probably pivot a number of companies and will start a number of companies moving forward. So that's kind of the total of the slides that I have. I have one more, which I'll show you later on. Actually, we can go to it now, maybe slide 6, and I would identify my thesis there. And that is the arc of power. And this is what I see as a major mega trend that's adjusting everything that's happening in consumer good and in retail in particular. But that isn't historically, on the left-hand side, the power was all with manufacturers. If you think about Henry Ford said, you can have any car you wanted, it'll be black. And his whole idea was amass a lot of capital, put it in tooling, and then produce mass amounts to be able to get something at a price where the market could accept it. Integral and central to what he was talking about was the concept that if he could produce one for masses, it would work, and he would develop a brand that would dictate to the market. Over time, the power shifted from the manufacturers to the retailers. That's the center. And the retailers start dictating what the consumers would see. They would determine the hours. They would determine if it was going to be in a retail store or if it was going to be online or in the catalog or how it was going to appear. They would determine the breadth of product that was offered, the depth of product, how frequently it was refreshed. And in fact, if they didn't like what the manufacturers were doing, they would have private label that would develop. But also a central theme that they had was they wanted to restrict the number of SKUs that were going into the market. And the reason is they had a very long supply chain. And that long supply chain meant they had to order product long before they had orders. The only way they could reduce their risk was by limiting the number of items that they were bringing in. Well, with the advent of the web, the power is now shifted to the consumer. And the consumer believes they can get what they want, when they want it, at what price they want it. Think of Amazon, think of Alibaba, think of Rakuten or whatever. Now, these are not infinite marketplaces, but the consumer sees them as such. And what the consumer is saying now, I want a lot of variety. I don't want the one that Henry Ford talked about. I don't want the few that the retailers talked about. I want something, I want it now, I want it in my way, and I want it in my style, and I'm going to change rapidly. Additive manufacturing is geared for this shift to the consumers. And I'm talking about retailing, but it works in manufacturing as well and supporting of these. And that is, there's going to be closer to home production. There's going to be more variety demanded by the customers. I just recently read a report saying that as a result of COVID, everybody is cutting back on the stock that they have, the offering that they have, that they're putting forward because of these issues, because they're afraid of the economic cost. The reality is they're bucking the trade winds. And what you will see coming out of this crisis is the need for close at home production with variety and change and that additive manufacturing can provide will be the rocket engine for this next recovery in my perspective. Sorry that it was so lengthy, but I get pretty excited about this topic.
Oh, thank you, Hap. I mean, so Blake, like in response to that, how has COVID affected you? What are, I know you guys are doing obviously some stuff in Texas and you were tapped for some stuff, but kind of, echoing on Hap, how has it affected you? And how do you see that, for example, this arc of power and this shift? Like, do you agree? Like, do you have your own perspective on this?
Yeah, I'd agree entirely, with the direction that arc is moving. I mean, you see consumer sentiment not only commanding more power, but also dramatically shortening the time scale by which decisions must be made, right? So if you look at, the release cycles for, things like planes, trains, and cars, they're nearly all governed by tooling. Like, when do you need to make a design decision, release the tooling, and then, that governs, that you can release a car in 3 years, right? So, but yeah, consumers want more customization, they want more speed, and they want their choices. They want to be able to have the power to change their mind. And all those things are incredibly disruptive for manufacturers. So if you look at supply chains and just where the decision rights need to rest, it's this evolutionary moment, I think, in broad scale manufacturing, where additive manufacturing kind of needs to catch up here, and can catch up ideally with actual manufacturing in terms of its power, its economics, its productivity. But those are going to be really, from what we're seeing, those are going to be the drivers, for, I think, the next wave. And it used to be that it was all based on technology. And while technology is still key and important, I believe now that we're starting to see shifts towards productivity, economics, consumption, things like that. And those are more of the classic drivers, I think, that have governed, classic manufacturing for a long time.
So then, kind of speaking of cars and kind of this whole model shifting and changing, Greg, kind of how do you see with your crystal ball, kind of this industry evolving? I mean, clearly, additive manufacturing is important, right? I mean, BMW literally just unveiled a new whole plant or factory specifically dedicated towards additive manufacturing. But even then, to the outsider, spending 15 million euros might not necessarily be a lot of money, right? What's your kind of perspective on this, and how do you see kind of the industry moving forward?
Yeah, so I think from BMW's perspective, additive is a massive push that we're going after right now with the opening of that factory, and that is specifically to research how to use the stuff in production. It's not just a cute little R&D sort of side project. But I think where perhaps the additive manufacturing industry as a whole needs to think bigger is to some of the things that Hap was talking about, because what additive enables you to do, and what I see the additive manufacturing industry talking a lot about, is things like, hey, we can take one part and make it lighter, or we can do mass customization of one or two parts, right? And they're talking about very point tactical solutions where additive manufacturing is doing things that traditional manufacturing can't do, right? But when you actually zoom out and take a bigger picture look at the entire supply chain, the overall cost savings and savings in terms of quality and things that you can do with a much shorter, closer to home, additive powered supply chain are orders of magnitude larger than any specific tactical advantage that any particular piece or any particular part you can create with additive can be. So where I see this industry going is that the whole industry really needs to go and educate the world, all manufacturers, to go and say, like, how do you actually redesign an entire global supply chain from scratch to have additive at the core, or this kind of agile mentality of a supply chain at the core? When someone like BMW looks at their supply chain, certain parts are going through hundreds of different vendors before they actually make it to us. The depth of the supply chain is, tens, dozens, hundreds of layers deep in some points. And because of that, you're seeing roughly 25% of all of the stuff manufactured in the entire world is lost to quality issues and problems in the supply chain. That's $3 trillion worth of waste in the entire global manufacturing process, that something like a rebuilt supply chain that is built from the ground up to understand additive, to shorten the supply chain, can actually eliminate that. And let's not even start talking about the CO2 impact and the sustainability impact of not having to throw away $3 trillion worth of stuff we ripped out of the ground. So I would say the long-term place that the additive industry needs to go is just think bigger and think about the total sort of cost of ownership across an entire supply chain when you can redesign it from the ground up.
Gotcha. James, you look like you're itching to talk.
Yeah, I think with the COVID, one thing HP learned is, we haven't seen this kind of mobilization since World War II of manufacturing, and it's been very inspiring. But, because of our reach and scale, we could actually, I was speaking to a key leader at HP yesterday, and he said that they could actually see COVID happen in Barcelona, actually where our HP 3D printing teams are located. And because we could actually react, we had the scientists, et cetera, to react to the problem. And more importantly, we could actually enable our digital manufacturing network of small vendors, et cetera, in local areas to actually attack this problem and then actually bring on critical medical products that are needed, right? And that's really the power of digital manufacturing, is our ability to look at supply chain, react to it locally, and more importantly, strike when it's needed, right? And so this has actually been a very positive outcome of COVID for HP, is it really kind of brought into the fore how our 3D printing teams can actually react to a customer market. And how we're really doing it, as you mentioned, is through mass customization. I think that really, in a much larger context, as was just described by Greg, mass customization is actually a key disruptive power of additive, right? But in a digital context, because it's part of the manufacturing process, not the thing in itself, right? That's a key fundamental problem that I hear with additive. It's that it's a thing in itself. It really should be part of the larger manufacturing process that is 100% production focused. And until we can get production focused, we're going to be where we are in the short time past. So I think companies like, Carbon, HP, right, Desktop Metal, et cetera, all getting in the fray, right, is really a key leadership, next step for this moving forward. But the key is the startups that we work with, right? I'm always at an intersection between a large company and a startup. Those startups bring great ideas and execution capabilities that we need to draft off of and actually and really kind of bring to market and scale. That's the power of the large companies, scaling a third party, a smaller third party startup like Dyndrite and others, our ability to kind of impact that entire market.
So, I mean, speaking of shrinking supply chains and startups, like Travis, I mean, I know you've had a number of, unique insights specifically in the consumer space, right? Like, what's your kind of take on shrinking supply chain, and, and how do you see these costs kind of compressing?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's exciting about additive, and especially as new technologies have been developed that enable you to hit a wider range of material properties and colors and things that really belong in consumer products, is that you start to look at using additive to not just displace one single product or one single injection molded part, but instead being able to displace many different assembly processes and manual components of processes that basically make the cost value proposition much more enticing. And I would say that, a lot of the major brands and manufacturers have been aware in the back of their mind that basically the supply chain that they have right now has some flaws in it, and it has areas where it can break down. And I think that this COVID disaster has really acted as a catalyst that, while it's causing a lot of companies to cut costs and look at their bottom lines, it's also causing them to really realize that they need to invest now in these advanced manufacturing supply chains that will enable them to basically deliver to the consumers the vision that Hap discussed earlier on.
So Greg, and Hap both kind of talked about, this evolution of the manufacturing sector, right? And Greg specifically talked about kind of this high level industrial technological drag, right? Because people are clearly thinking in one, version of manufacturing, and they need to kind of dramatically evolve, how they're thinking about it. So Blake, where do you feel like you guys fit into this, right? Like, what do you think is sort of holding this industry back, right? I mean, one could say CNC manufacturing sort of figured itself out in about 30 to 40 years, right? And additive is right around that mark, yet it still feels like most folks are still researching and trying to figure out, prototyping, right? So Blake, in your opinion, kind of what's holding the industry back, and what key things do we need to fix?
I mean, a couple of things. I'm, as a materials scientist by training, I'm kind of biased on the materials side. So I think by getting more materials out into the factory floor environment and focusing on that ecosystem, then I think, you're going to see some big breakthroughs. But I really resonate with, some of what, Greg and James have said as well, also on the supply chain side. I mean, additive manufacturing is one step, but there's post-processing, there's, pre-processing of the file, there's the entire ecosystem that all has to get looked at. So when the costs come down and the access goes up, for the whole ecosystem, to be more open platform and to be more accessible, just like classic manufacturing platforms now are, such as CNC milling and injection molding and grinding and all these classic sort of subtractive manufacturing techniques. You've got all these vendors that really play well in the sandbox, so to speak, in factory floors. Additive's got to be able to do the same thing. Whether you've got an extrusion platform or a powder bed platform, you have to be able to plug into the ecosystems, position your solution in a way that can be purchased and procured through the procurement channels at these large enterprises, and then also plug into whatever their manufacturing execution software is, and not tie the hands of the customer. And once we get to the point where, as an additive industry, we are, I would say, holistically approaching our offerings to say, hey, my offering's got to play nice with 3 or 4 other offerings immediately adjacent to what we really do well, then I think you'll start to see additive become more productive, like these classic manufacturing solutions have been. And I agree that I think we're on the cusp of that.
So, Hap, as someone who has, famously brought a lot of technology to bear, in your industry, what are some lessons you learned about, from an industry adoption standpoint, and what do you feel like folks are currently doing well or not well in this space?
Well, it's a big story. The first thing is that you never want to let a crisis go to waste. I mean, effectively, what happens is, as long as everything is going along well, as it has been, we had in the US 12 years of growth, the economy was going up, there isn't much reason to change, even though there might be approaches. And at that time, particularly in the industries which I'm familiar with, like apparel and footwear and such, cost was driven down by offshore production in places like China, India, Indonesia. But the reality is costs have been creeping up in those areas and will be equal to the Western world in the not too distant future. So companies have actually taken out some of the make in their products. They're making it not quite so good because they think that the only way they can hold on to the cost is by reducing what the consumer is getting. We've gotten to a point, which is an inflection point, where costs are going up and the production offshore is not as effective as it once was. A crisis like this is developing it. And I would say that where I've seen the biggest problem is our accounting systems don't work. Our accounting systems are oftentimes first cost based system. And people do not look at the cost as the other people were talking about of what's thrown away. They're not looking at what is made that is never consumed. We now have another driver for the markets, and that's sustainability. And sustainability is one that says we have to do more with less. We have to not put things into the landfill. We cannot pollute the oceans. We cannot ruin the world with climate change. That is a driver. So on one hand, you have costs going up in offshore, so that's driving it. The second one is you have more awareness of the need for sustainability, and you couple that with the fact that we have a crisis that says it is time to change if you as a company want to survive. I think all of those things will do it. But previously what we had is incrementalism. If we could just get by for another year, live on quarter to quarter earnings and everybody's getting by, it's okay to stay with what you have. Now we're going to have to rethink all of those things. So I think it is a propitious time, a unique time for this industry to come forth. And you always need one of those catalysts to change things. And as I said, you never want to let a good crisis go to waste.
Greg, you look like you're itching to talk. I mean, continuing on the sustainability topic, I know BMW has been making major investments in this space. Do you have more to add here?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just expand on this. I think we 100% agree. Like you need these sort of watershed moments to push an entire industry over the hump. And what we're seeing is kind of like a perfect storm of consumer sentiment really pushing the brands that they care about to start thinking about larger scale societal and climate impact of the products that they make. And consumers are voting with their dollars, right? And it's getting to a point where it doesn't really matter how much of a stalwart you were, you can't really argue with it. And especially if you are someone like a North Face or a BMW or, a Patagonia or these sorts of people who who have brands that sort of lean left and that a lot of people who are very progressive care about. But I think we're even seeing it in oil and gas industries, the likes of, you know, Total and Shell and BP also taking this stuff into account. So I would sort of double down on exactly what Hap's saying, that we've got to look at the overall supply chain cost of an item in a bigger picture, kind of like a triple bottom line way of looking at it. There's the cost of the unit, there's the total cost of the unit depending on your yields of how many are you actually using versus how many are you throwing away. And then there's the sort of societal impact of that unit. And when you actually take the full total cost of a lot of these parts into account, the additive or agile or digital way of manufacturing them just shoots off the scale in terms of how much better it actually is, as opposed to when you just look at that unit cost. Very often the additive part might actually be more expensive, right? But when you look at how many steps in the production process have I removed, how many 1,000 miles did I not have to put something on a ship, right? And take into account all of those other things, the additive way of doing things very rapidly rises to the top. And I think just us as an industry aren't talking about it that way, and we aren't educating the supply chain people and the CFOs at companies to really be looking at the big picture.
It's funny you said use the word watershed, right? Because HP's SVP, Ryan, also used that exact same term in that same context, literally just a month ago, right? So I don't think you're alone here. James, it seems like you also want to comment as well.
Well, you know, I think, you know, I think you kind of looked at why are we kind of stuck in some ways. I would say that, you know, one of the key things is we call this the fourth industrial revolution, right? And I've always thought of adoption really requires overwhelming value add, not just an incremental minor adjustment that it's a little faster, 20% cheaper, et cetera. But part of it is each industrial revolution occurred because a major visionary, a group of visionaries put something forward, right? It really drove a fundamental change. And it really required, it was done out of sheer will, right? And they're in a competition, but it really required an audacious move and a major fundamental change in the industry, right? And I think digital manufacturing versus additive, it's what is going to drive that massive change to digital end-to-end workflow, right? And I always think of where we're kind of stuck in the mud is, you know, we've been, you know, you can't look at it as a hardware manufacturer. That's why Ryan is a fantastic leader to have aboard HP right now. He's a software-centric, problem-centric, opportunity-centric leader, right? And we're looking at this problem from an end-to-end opportunity, not just how do we make a better printer, right? And that's the difference. And to be honest, we need that competitive marketplace. That's why I kind of mentioned everybody else, right? Is that without audacious leaders really driving a fundamental change and them thinking very, very big and not just what we can do today, you won't drive change. You won't drive substantive, massive change in a manufacturing environment, right? And I think that, you know, electrification of vehicles, autonomous, new changes in aerospace, right? Space itself are perfect verticals for us to attack, as well as we looked at mass customization of medical devices, et cetera, right? Whether it's our partners like Smile Direct, et cetera. This is actually bringing digital manufacturing to the fore.
Yeah, I would just chime in just for a brief second on that. I would say, yeah, the technology leaders and the startups, I think it's fairly easy to find courage there. But the thing that I'm heartened by here in this conversation, as well as others, but there are also courageous investors present, right? Because classically, it has been all about the single bottom line. What can you provide in the way of investor return, and when can you provide it by? And so those singular, you know, areas of focus are really driving the startups, and they're driving large corporations alike to focus on, okay, how can I just, you know, have, as you were saying, live quarter by quarter or over some short-term balance cycle? But we need that courage and that watershed to also be present in the investor community, so that the investor community is rewarding courageous startups and is patient with courageous startups when you have to pivot, when you have to, you know, look at the full life cycle and say, well, you know, we weren't going to make masks, but we've made a bunch of them. We weren't going to do military, but now we're printing service parts for ground vehicles and flying vehicles, you know, all this stuff, because we're looking at the end of life and these whole life cycles. But the courageous ad on the investor side, I would argue, is actually, you know, where as much of the evolution and the new thinking needs to happen, because it's kind of easy to find courageous entrepreneurs. But I think, you know, what's exciting here is hopefully we can start to find more and more courage in the investment community, which I think is intriguing.
Yeah, and, you know, do you mind if I interject for just 1 second?
Yeah, no,
I think that was actually very well said. And one problem I see with COVID is that, you know, a lot of early stage digital manufacturing companies are funded by strategic investors, not just pure VCs, right? So that the rise of the strategic investor has really been a significant change in the investment community around the last 15 years. The problem is strategic investors are the first to cautiously pull back when they should be hitting the throttle, right? And that's my concern right now, is that you know, we consolidate rounds, we work together in investing, right? It's a small investment community. My concern is that people in this time of opportunity are pushing off the throttle, playing it cautiously. Their CFOs are saying, please don't make any you know, bad decisions right now. Let's conserve capital, when this is the opportunity right now. And there's great companies. You know, I applaud what you're saying. I think this is really the watershed moment right now for investors.
Blake, did you want to add more? I mean,
no, I mean, I think, you know, yeah, you've got to fund, you know, during all phases of the business cycle, right? It's easy to fund during a 12-year bull market. You know, it's tough to fund, you know, when you're in the middle of a pandemic and the startups are like, hey, I had all these plans A, B, C, D, but I did not have plan, you know, triple Z, you know, on my pro forma. But, you know, I think having that partnership is so important between, you know, the willing capital and the courageous, you know, folks, you know, around the table, the stockholders, the shareholders, and the customers, right? Because you've got to get the customer you know, you need all sides of that. And I think it's happening. I think, you know, people are seeing things in a new way, not just from a public health perspective, but, you know, from a societal perspective. And I think there's so much health in how new things are being seen. So hopefully that transcends also into manufacturing.
Yeah, maybe I can just kind of add some tactical stuff here, because I think we've got a lot of entrepreneurs who are watching, who are probably wondering, you know, how to raise money. That the corporate VCs are a double-edged sword to what's been said so far, right? Like, typically they're the most likely to understand your technology, but also, as we said, kind of the first to pull back in the middle of a downturn. And so as you are going out and trying to meet corporate investors, one of the critical questions you should be asking them is how they're structured as a fund. Typically, if they're investing off of headquarters balance sheets, then they are most likely going to be in that bucket of people who are forced to pull back in a downturn, right? They're sort of at the whim of the CFO typically. Whereas there are a bunch of corporate funds that are actually set up as completely independent funds. They have their own pool of capital, and those are the people who will likely not be impacted by a downturn like this, and they're able to sort of keep investing like a more traditional VC. So when you're trying to meet potential investors, you want to try and self-select for those sorts of people who can kind of thread the needle on the best of both worlds. They should be able to understand you, be a partner like a traditional corporate, but then not have the downsides of the corporate. I will give us a shameless plug here that we are one of those funds that's set up completely independently, but just as a heuristic, you should be keeping that sort of thing in mind.
I would certainly argue to look at that chart that I showed before about the companies that grew out of the last crisis. If there was ever a time for courageous investing, one would look at that chart and say, this is the time. It is remarkable. Look at the companies, DocuSign, SpaceX, Tesla. Of course, there are those, you know, the Elon Musk and whatever, but there were investors coming in. It wasn't just Elon Musk putting his money out there. And if you look at the great financial crisis, Square, Uber, Airbnb, this is the time for people to be bold if they want the huge upside in terms of investment. Now, you have to be selective and you have to do the right thing and the approach and understand the market. But this, I think, is a unique opportunity this is a time where you're going to, if you look at it 10 years from now, you're going to say, some people pulled in their horns, some strategics did, and some other people made bold moves. And those are the ones that are going to have the outsized returns. And that is ultimately what you're looking for, because it's a bell-shaped curve that you get in any investment. You have a couple home runs, and you have a couple that go out of business, and others you just try to get rid of because they aren't going anywhere. But this is a time when a couple of those home runs, in my view, are going to show up.
I think it's also really important that the courageous investors come together with the courageous customers, because especially for some of the earlier stage startups in additive manufacturing that are bringing forward some of the most innovative technologies, the customers need basically that validation that these startups are going to have the funds that they need to actually bring this technology all the way forward through manufacturing in order to take that plunge. So it's really important that these are paired together to create the real manufacturing revolution that we're hoping for.
So to kind of instigate even more drama and tension, I think everyone is kind of converging on the same thought, right? And I mean, like, to those who are listening, right? Like, this whole discussion wasn't planned. It is truly organic, right? And so to that end, I'll kind of use this as a segue as we're coming, to the kind of close of this panel. I'll ask everyone essentially the same question. It's, clearly a lot of turnover is happening. Clearly, entrepreneurs are, going through their perseverance, and clearly, a lot of folks are even passing up opportunities, right? And so, I'll kind of go down the line a bit. Like, I'll start with Blake. Blake, what are you excited about from the future? And I mean, I even know that there are investors in the room and across the panel who have even passed up on you, right? Like what's your kind of thought there? And how would you kind of advise folks to think about you guys differently, for example? And I suspect that type of advice is going to echo across the entire industry.
Yeah, I just think, you've got to know kind of where you are in your story. You've got to know where you are in your narrative, and people arrive at different places in their narrative at different times, and so a lot about what comprises an investment decision is sort of where's the startup in their narrative, and where's the fund in their narrative, and what's the appetite of a partner, and like Greg was mentioning, CVCs have different mandates, and so you got to find the right kind of CVC mandate fit. So actually at Essentium, we've been very fortunate. We've got a couple CVCs with great mandates, and they've been very patient, and that's been great. But, folks who understand our materials side and our software side, things like that. But in reality, I think as we look again, going forward, just be clear. If you're a startup entrepreneur, be very clear about where you are in your narrative. Just say, hey, I tried 14 things. One looks like it's working really, really well, and we're gonna try to push really hard on that. Or whatever your story is, be very clear about that. And there's a lot of capital in the wings. There's a ton of capital out there. You can find the capital if you are very clear about your narrative, very clear about what your opportunity is, and how fast you can get there. And it's a lot of crystal ball and those things, but again, just clarity, I think, there's so much chaos right now. So clarity, I think, is perhaps the most valuable commodity, really, whether it's on the side of the startup or even the side of the fund.
So, same question to you, Travis. I know you guys have also been evolving your narrative and story. What would you have to say to the audience and the panel at large?
So I think we've had a really interesting story, and one of the components of this that was so exciting was basically going through the process of finding customers, finding investors, and obviously constant rejection is a natural part of this process, but that's what helps you to basically evolve your technology, evolve your business model to find something that really gives you the most traction. And this comes from the product market fit on the customer side, and also from the business model and financials on the investor side. And going through that process really led us to the strong business model and product offering that we have today. So I think it's something that I would recommend and not shy away from as an entrepreneur getting into the additive manufacturing game.
So now turning it over more to the investor side, James, if you care to mention, have you passed up on anyone? That you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, actually, I'm going to cut out. I just wanted to draft up one thing real quick, and I'll tell you if I passed on, because it still hurts me to this day. One is that from, and this is actually the startups, because I think it's important to hear. Besides capital, and I've been a founder, and I've been on the VC side and the CVC side, right? A fundamental advantage of working with the CVC is not just the capitalization. I would say figure out how to work on commercialization. And that's what we're really doing hard at HBTV, right, at HB Tech Ventures. Commercialization provides market validation and scalability for that startup, right? To date, we've done 36 different commercializations that really help drive the next round for that company, right? And so it's not just POCs, it's actually working together, with customers, right? So we'll bring you to our global customers and help scale you. That is invaluable. And especially this time where I do know that strategic investors are pulling back, look to them as validation and a commercialization, right? Now I'll get back to my other story. So I met Elon really early, and right when before the Roadster was coming out. And to be honest, I'm kind of noted in finding, great leaders. And so I passed, and I looked at the problems that this little Roadster is made out of, England, the Lotus, right? And cell phone batteries and arrays, cell phone batteries. And I saw, my God, there's no charging stations, etc. What I missed is what the larger vision that really drove that company. The vision number one was that the infrastructure is just as important as the car, right? So everything from the gigafactory to the speed recharging stations are critical disruption points, right? The second part, and I think is even more important for certain car companies, is that he actually looked at Apple and took the customer experience and turned it on its head. Instead of going to a dealer, right, he now controlled the conversation with the customer and the customer experience, right? So those are fundamental things that if I knew he was going down, I would invest in 30 seconds. But I didn't make the mistake. I invested in SpaceX, right? But at the end of the day, that was my biggest loss. I would have loved to have had that early on.
Greg, I mean, I guess the same question, right? Has anyone surprised you? Has anyone kind of, like, where are you seeing this future go, right? Because you see, I don't know how many companies at a given day, what surprised you? Have you kind of regretted not investing in someone, if you care to share?
Yeah, I think just to kind of, what's surprising us, and it's leading into a sort of broader investment thesis here, is we're already pretty heavily indexed in additive manufacturing, right? So we're invested in Desktop Metal and Carbon. I think Rick from Desktop is in the chat room somewhere. We're invested in Xometry, for example, and actually because of that, we've got a bit of an unfair advantage seeing just the massive uptick that additive and sort of digital manufacturing is seeing across the market now in COVID, right? And so we're taking that and we're turning it into an investment thesis of, let's kind of start with a blank sheet of paper. What does a next generation supply chain look like? And then slowly but surely sort of walking through all of the pieces there that are required and figuring out, are we over-indexed in a space, or do we have holes in the portfolio for what that is interesting, for what is required out there to make this kind of like next generation supply chain. And so I'll say we're looking pretty broadly here at everything from next generation MES systems and ERP systems that are actually required in order for a large corporation to do additive manufacturing at scale, all the way through to the additive technologies themselves and enabling technologies like yourself. So I think what rather than someone I've passed on, what has surprised us has been the massive resilience of additive in this COVID time, and how much of a tailwind a bunch of our companies actually seem to be getting from it. And that's leading us to just really double down on the space now, because we do think this is the first signs of that watershed moment we've been talking about so much.
I know Hap has to leave right now. Hap, before you leave, do you have a parting thought of wisdom?
I don't know if it's wisdom, but I have a lot of parting thoughts. There are two I'd like to do. One leading, following on what was said before. Innovation is not equal to invention. Innovation is equal to invention plus commercialization. The only way we get so excited about the invention, we think it's the end all and the be all. It has to prove that it's commercial out there. The second thought is that all great ideas, and I heard this from Buckminster Fuller, who I worked with, and always stuck with me as being amazing, and that is all great thoughts come in the valleys between disciplines. All great ideas come in the valley between disciplines. What you need is an ecosystem to talk about something. If you have the same people, whether it's materials people talking to materials people, software engineers talking to software engineers, or you have salespeople talking to salespeople, they all look at things in their own little way. What you really need is people of different disciplines getting together. And what we've had is not enough of that in this industry. People who are in production, people in supply chain, people in development, people in product, all working together, because when they start talking, they will come up with the innovative ideas.
Thank you, Hap. So I'm being told that we're kind of at the hour now. I wanted to appreciate everyone who has kind of joined us today. Thank you, Travis, Greg, Blake, James, and Hap. I mean, I know we probably all wish that we could probably sit here and be a fly on the wall for a lot longer, but I truly do appreciate all of your time. To everyone who's watching, I hope it was as valuable to you as it was to me. So again, thank you, and
Thanks,
a round
Harshil. Thanks, guys.
of